How are domestic and global hunger similar? We've touched on this a number of times in this class. Vulnerability is always a key common element. Hunger affects the poor, the poorest in any country. No matter how you define the poorest, generally they are those with the least resources. They are the most vulnerable, as we've explained. And they, at the same time, then can be transitory hungry in certain cases. So they're temporarily hungry or temporarily poor. Oftentimes I say to my students in classrooms, think of yourself as transitory poor. You're paying tuition, you're maybe working part-time in that, you don't have a lot of savings, you have money. I mean, you may consider yourself poor, and you are perhaps, but the point is that you have potential through your education to earn much more money and pay off your student loans and that, but you understand what it is, for example, when you come to hunger issues, you understand what it is to eat badly and cheaply at the same time, right? It's quick, it's easy to simply spend money on fast food when you're a busy student and feel you don't have a lot of time and money. And this is the way it is for many in the first world, where the hungry poor will often make poor choices about nutrition simply because they're stressed. They are the working poor. They are simply trying to make ends meet, and they always don't make the best choices. It can be a transitory situation. Definition, location of the most vulnerable, that can differ slightly. Key issue for many countries when you're looking at how hunger is addressed in that country or in that region is what's in the government's toolkit or in the community's toolkit. What programs do they have available to assist the hungry poor? And in cases of larger countries like the U.S. with sufficient resources, they'll have nationwide safety net programs, which you've learned about, that can be very effective in dealing with the most extreme cases of hunger and lack of food in these countries. You've learned that hunger, whether you're in an international situation or in a domestic situation, will always affect women and children the most. And overall, globally, this has a major drain on the world's economy. This is a major impediment to the positive aspects of economic development that globalization brings. It's the opportunity costs of hunger that always have to be considered. We've talked about the reality of the Black Belt in terms of trying to understand vulnerability in the Deep South. We could do the same type of analysis virtually anywhere in the world where you have vulnerable people. As I've explained in this class and we've talked about a number of times, the issue is not to dwell on the history in any particular region or a particular country, but simply to understand, as we've done with the Alabama case study, why is it that today in this same region, which used to be the richest region in the old days, 100 years ago, is now one of the poorest regions? What are the issues as to why people living in these areas are among the poorest, the most food insecure? Once you understand these reasons, you better then understand what it is to remedy the situation. You remember this slide of the number of enslaved Americans prior to the Civil War, and how these darker counties here has the higher percentage of the enslaved Americans in these areas, and they mirror the map that you've just seen on the Black Belt. So again, the richest area also had the highest number of enslaved African Americans who were slaves in those areas at that time. But states like Alabama were some of the richest in the U.S. at that time in the mid-1850s, because this was the breadbasket. This is where cotton was king, was the term. And there's a major driver of the economy in the entire U.S. Well, that changed, and it changed for lots of different reasons. But the thing today is that when you understand better what the changes were in terms of access to public education, for example, you better understand what the public policy options are in order to improve the conditions, the food security conditions in this case, of the poorest in these areas. In Bangladesh, the example which we've used, and you've seen this slide now a number of times, you take stock through vulnerability assessment mapping, through the work that Professor Alexander talked about in understanding the poorest of the poor. I've explained that around the world we look at the numbers of the amount of calories that people consume among the poorest of the poor. I used the example of Bangladesh, a very densely populated country. The 2,100 calories that a person consumes per day, that is a poverty line level. And in countries like Bangladesh, we focus on the 1,800 kilocalorie level, which is defined as the ultra poor, which is what the poorest of the poor, the most food insecure, are considered in Bangladesh. And you've learned that 1,800 calories a day is not sustainable for life longer term. These are the people who, at this level of calorie consumption, will contract a cold or another slight ailment that any of us here in the first world would otherwise recover from. This is they will contract a cold or something that will become much worse and develop into pneumonia, for example, and they will literally die of that ailment. And this is again where the numbers come from when we talk about the numbers of people who die every day from hunger. They're not strictly dying from lack of food, no food, famine situation. They simply have serious underlying malnutrition conditions, physical conditions in their body. They're not consuming sufficient calories or don't get the access to the micronutrients that they require, and they suffer from that mentally and physically. And then you recall the graph that explains the higher that your income is, the less you'll spend on food, and the lower your income is, the more of your income that you will simply spend on food. And you'll see, you remember that the dynamic of those in terms of their everyday life, their life dynamic is that they are literally living from hand to mouth, spending an inordinate amount of their waking day simply trying to feed themselves and their family. In Bangladesh again, an example of a country with severe overpopulation, as you've learned, where among the most vulnerable livelihoods are affected every year by the extent of the flooding. Flooding, again, not necessarily being a bad thing, because it rejuvenates the land. It's some of the most fertile land in the world. But when you've got too many people living in many of the wrong places, then the flooding will be a very negative thing to those, again, who are the most vulnerable, who have lack of access to the higher land, for example, and have nowhere to go when the flooding, which is otherwise a good thing, as I say, when the flooding comes every year.